Hello everyone, I am Dr. Deepak Kumar, Assistant Professor, Department of History, the Bhopal School of Social Sciences. In this series of lecture of the Constitutional History of India, today we are going to discuss the Charter Act of 1853. Now, before we start discussing the main provisions provided in this act, let's discuss the background or the circumstances in which this act was enacted. The period between 1833 and 1853 was a very dynamic one. In this period, we see politically conscious Indians were agitating against the reactionary government of the British East India Company. For example, Raja Ram Mohan Rai, he went to England and represented India's case before the British Parliamentary Select Committee. On the similar lines, Bombay Association and the Madras Native Association also sent their petitions. This can be seen as the beginning of the political agitation in India. Indians were dissatisfied. Why? Because the British government failed in appointing Indians to a higher position, as they promised in the previous Charter Act of 1833. So, people of Madras, they were sending their petitions through Lord Ellenborough for the welfare of the people. People of Bombay also sent their petitions through Lord Monteagle to abolish the dual system. So, Indians were demanding that the East India Company's charter should not be renewed and the dual system should be abolished. So, this was the dynamics in the period between 1833 and 1853 in India. What was happening in England at the same time? In England, all the leaders of the parties, the ministers, including the president of the board of control and the company directors, they were all opposing it, and they were all favoring that the East India Company's charter should be renewed. So, when the term of the charter of the 1833 was about to expire, Lord Dalhousie was asked by the authorities in England on his opinion as to what changes to be introduced. So, Lord Dalhousie in response wrote a masterly essay consisting of 167 paragraphs, and he entitled this paragraph or this whole document as the Government of India, in which he strongly advocated for the supreme control vested in the Governor General's Council. Subsequently, this act was enacted. So, this was the background or the circumstances in which this act was enacted. Now, it's the time to discuss the main provisions. One of the main provisions of this act was that it renewed the powers of the East India Company. But unlike the previous Charter Act, this time it said only until Parliament shall otherwise provide. This is a very significant provision. By the Charter Act of 1833, the separation of the executive functions from the legislative functions were carried a step further by the provision of an additional members of the council for the sole purpose of legislation. As a result, the law member was made a full member of the Governor General's Executive Council. All the legislation now required the consent of the Governor General. So, Governor General's consent was now made mandatory. So, in this whole framework, we can see how the central legislature is completed. Another main provision of this act provided that the company was allowed now to retain its possession in India. The act also provided for the council to increase its legislative capacity up to 12 members. Now, who were these 12 members? These were Governor General himself, the Commander-in-Chief, the 4 members of his council and the 6 legislative members. The Act also reduced the numbers of the directors. The numbers of the directors previously was around 24. Now it was reduced to 18. And the Act said that out of this 18, 6 members should be Crown nominated. All the vacancies in India were now to be filled in by the competitive examination. And for that purpose, Lord Macaulay was appointed the president of the committee. The Charter Act of 1853 neatly distinguished the legislative councillors from the executive councillors. And by doing so, legislation for the first time in India was treated as a special function of the government, which required special machinery and special procedure. All the business of the council was conducted in public. All the procedures adopted for the transaction of business was similar to the British Parliament. As a result, all the councillors were now putting questions. They were demanding papers. They were even asking information, and if there was any lapses or excesses, government was criticized. This was a right move in right direction. So these were the main provisions provided by this Act. Now let's discuss the significance of the Act. The Charter Act of 1853 is significant in many ways. For example, for the first time, the legislative and the executive function of the Governor General's Council were separated. The Act also extended the Companies Rule. Now previously, we see that the Charter Act extended Companies Rule for limited 20 years. But this Act extended Companies Rule for an indefinite period. And this was done so that the British government could take over anytime. The legislative wing of the Governor General's Council was now acting as a parliament on the model of the British Parliament. Now this is basically the foundation of the modern parliamentary form of government. Again, right move in right direction. Another significant aspect of this Act was that the company's influence was decreased and the Crown's influence was increased. This can be seen in this provision where board of directors, the number of board of directors were 24 and now it was reduced to 18. And even out of these 18, 6 members were now Crown nominated. This shows how company's influence or power were decreasing and the Crown's power or influence was increasing. The Act of 1853 is significant because it gave birth to the Indian Civil Services, which was open to all, including the Indians. This Indian Civil Services ended the system of appointments by recommendation, and because of it, they started a new system of open and fair competitions. So this was the Charter Act of 1853. We discussed the background or the circumstances under which this Act was enacted. We also discussed the main provisions and the significance of this Act. That's all. Thank you.